Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to be very brief. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ethan Katz. I'm the faculty director of the Center for Jewish Studies. Really pleased to welcome you to our lecture this evening. I'm introducing the introducer, so I'm going to be very short. This is one of several events that we have this year in our Antisemitism Education Initiative speaker series. And we're really delighted to have Jeffrey Herf, who's one of the most distinguished scholars of anti-Semitism in the United States, and who I had the pleasure of sitting with at Stanford yesterday and learning with and arguing with a little bit and learning from. So looking forward to learning more from him this evening, and we're in for a treat and a lively lecture and discussion, I'm sure. I'm going to turn things over now to Greg Drinkwater, who is the program director for the Antisemitism Education Initiative and who does really remarkable work making a great deal of anti-Semitism education and training and support for students happen on our campus. Thanks.
So welcome everyone, thank you for being here, and I really appreciate you coming out on this, what will soon be a rainy Wednesday evening. I manage the Antisemitism Education Initiative, which, for those who don't know, does exactly what it sounds like. I focus on education. We're not an advocacy organization. Our role is to educate and to improve the capacity for campus stakeholders, students, faculty, staff, but also community members, alumni, parents, donors, to recognize anti-Semitism and to intervene constructively in decreasing the amount of anti-Semitism that students, faculty, and staff face on our campus. I also do provide support to other campuses in the state and the country, but my primary focus is on UC Berkeley. And also just wanted to take the second, I did not tell Rory that I was going to do this, but we have a new staffer with us in the Center for Jewish Studies who divides her efforts between some broader Center for Jewish Studies initiatives and also the Antisemitism Education Initiative, Rabbi Rory Katz, who joined us 3 months ago. So thank you for Rory being here. So we're here tonight to hear from Jeffrey Herf, who is Distinguished University Professor Emeritus in the Department of History at the University of Maryland, College Park. And his scholarship examines 20th century German and European history, especially the era of Nazism, the Holocaust, and the memory of the Holocaust in Germany, but also the impact of these developments on Israel and the Middle East. And his publications are numerous. They include some sort of groundbreaking and core texts in German history, reactionary modernism, technology, culture, and politics in Weimar and the Third Reich, which came out in 1984, and I remember reading as a grad student here in Berkeley in the late 1990s in a seminar with Christoph Hoffmann. Divided Memory, The Nazi Past, and the Two Germanys in 1997, which I also remember reading as a grad student, so thank you. You contributed significantly to my grad student journey. Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, which came from Yale University Press in 2009. In Cambridge University Press 2016, a book called Undeclared Wars with Israel, East Germany, and the West German Far Left from 1967 to 1989, which I will also share, had a role in helping my late husband, David Schneer, in a project he was doing on Ben Yaldati, a major figure of Jewish culture and Yiddish culture in East Germany. So, sorry for the personal sides, but I've been aware of Jeffrey Herf for many, many years, but only met him today. Israel's Moment, International Support and Opposition for Establishing the Jewish State, 1945 to 1949, Cambridge University Press of 2022. And his newest book, Three Faces of Anti-Semitism, Right, Left, and Islamist, which was published in London by Routledge in January 2024. So he's among those few historians who's published work on all three of the major forms in which anti-Semitism has appeared in modern European and world history. So we're really delighted to have him here today. Thank you, Professor Herf.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Ethan. I have a soft spot for the history department at Berkeley. I've spoken at this department, 2 or 3 times, and I have enormous respect for what this department stands for in the profession of history. Greg, you spoke about having read works of mine. Well, I've read works of faculty from this department for decades as well, so it's a real pleasure. My next door neighbor works for the Department of Health and Human Services, and she oversees Medicaid centers that treat poor people all over the United States. We like her very much, and we don't want her to lose her house and get fired by Elon Musk. I begin with that little anecdote because doing intellectual work today in this era of polarization about a question like anti-Semitism is very difficult. And one of the things that Ethan has tried to do, and I gather with some success, is to address these issues without finding oneself in one camp or the other. And that's what I've tried to do for many years. That's why I decided to put a collection of my essays called Three Faces of Anti-Semitism, Right, Left, and Islamist, between two covers. So people who would want to read about Hitler and Goebbels would have an essay there, and people who wanted to read about Ulbricht and Erich Milke, there's an essay there, and those who wanted to read about Tajmin al-Husseini and Muslim Brotherhood, they could, by having the same book in their hands, it might encourage them, hopefully, to read about all of them. It is my effort to push back against this era of polarization that's making life so difficult for all of us. Before I plunge into the heart of the talk, I want to say a little bit about Germany today. I'm retired, which means that I have a full-time fellowship for teaching and for research and publication. And on 9/11, the government in Germany was a coalition of Greens and Social Democrats. It was a left-of-center government, so it was different than the Bush administration. And the interior minister was a man named Otto Schily. And those of you who know about German history know that Otto Schily emerged out of the 1960s left, and he was the lawyer for the Red Army faction terrorist organization in the 1970s. And having seen all of that up close, Schily clearly changed his mind and eventually emerged as the interior minister of Germany, overseeing the writing of anti-terrorism laws in the fall of 2001 and winter 2002. And my point here is that Schily, Joschka Fischer, Volker Beck, among writers, Matthias Kunzel, a left-leaning liberal generation of German intellectuals was coming to terms with Al-Qaeda, with Hamas, with Hezbollah, with the Islamic Republic of Iran, which was particularly despised by German leftists because there were many of their Iranian friends who had come to Berlin escaping first the Shah and then the Ayatollahs, who then saw their friends, their leftist friends in Iran executed in the thousands. So there was a kind of disillusionment about Iran as well. And what that all that meant was that this left-leaning liberal generation that had come to power, not just in the universities, but it was in the chancellor's office and the ministries, took Islamism seriously. And they took Islamist anti-Semitism seriously. And they were not intimidated by the phrase Islamophobia. They made distinctions, much more than the Bush administration did, much more, between Islam and Islamism. And we think of the United States as big and tough, and the Germans and the Europeans as soft and woolly. But when it came to the intellectual discussion of these questions about anti-Semitism, the discussion in Germany was in the last 25 years was richer, more developed, less polarized than was the case in the United States. So my talk today benefits to some extent from that. One of the most famous slogans or phrases that emerged from the historiography of the study of National Socialism and the creation of the collapse of Weimar and the rise of the Nazi regime was the problem of underestimation. And it was the phrase coined by I suppose a right-wing liberal would be a way of describing Karl Dietrich Bracher in his works on the collapse of the Weimar Republic and then the German dictatorship, Die Deutsche Diktatur, which he published in 1969 and then was published in English translation in 1970. And the problem of underestimation was that the conservatives assumed that Hitler was someone who would moderate once he was in power. The socialists and the communists still very much interpreted Nazism through the lenses of Marxism and viewed Hitler as a tool of the capitalist class. And there were too few people who took Hitler seriously. And so one of the slogans of the historiography of a generation of German historians of Nazism that came of age in the 1950s and the 1960s was that this problem of underestimation was a one reason that Hitler was not kept out of power, that Hitler could have been kept out of power, but that intellectually the German political establishment found itself unable to understand. Of course, there were people who understood what he stood for perfectly well, and that's why they supported him. So we're not trying to romanticize that reality. But as Marty J. Did so much to stimulate, foster, support the tradition of intellectual and cultural history in this country. That's one of the things I want to do tonight, again, to reemphasize how important intellectual and cultural history is for understanding not only those years, but more recent ones. So that era is an era in which there was an era of underestimation. And my point tonight is that we have endured a second era of underestimation. And that second era of underestimation has to do with the way that American and British and European intellectuals have and have not understood the ideology of Islamism and its relationship to anti-Semitism. So the key text here in this history is the Hamas Charter of 1988, which was first published in English by a little-known Islamic press in Dallas, Texas in 1990. It's a very, very interesting translation with somewhat broken English, but it captures the passion of the Charter very well. And then the Charter was posted on the Avalon Project in Documents in Law, History, and Diplomacy at Yale Law School, which has the documents of the Nuremberg trials in 2008. And yet, the Charter received remarkably little attention from intellectual and cultural historians. But it is a key text to understanding what I'm calling a 90-year history, a 90-year war of religion that began in the 1930s and that continued up to October 7th and after in the attempt to eliminate the Zionist presence and then the state of Israel. The key text of the 1930s that stands at the beginning of this tradition was written by Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, in September of 1937. And he was on the run because the British Mandate authorities in Palestine were trying to arrest him after his role in the revolt of 1936-39. He wrote a text called Islam and the Jews, which was read in his absence to a gathering of pan-Arab activists in Blue Dawn, Syria, in September of 37. And in 1938, Juncker and Dunlop, a publisher in Berlin, close to the regime, the Nazi regime, published the German translation of Islam and the Jews. And this, and I want to stress this, Islam and the Jews is not the result of Nazi propaganda. And so one of the things that intellectual and cultural historians do, whether this is because of, I don't know, where there are many traditions. I had a sojourn through sociology, so Max Weber flows through the veins, is to give agency to these people, to take what they say seriously as not simply the results of what is done to them or the impact by the West, but as people with agency of their own. And Islam and the Jews is a work of interpretation of the Quran that became very influential. And I'll just read a few lines of it. He wrote, "The battle between the Jews and Islam began when Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina. In those days, the Jewish methods were exactly the same as they are today. Then as now, slander was their weapon." And he goes on about how they attacked Muhammad. "The verses of the Quran and the Hadith assert the Jews were Islam's most bitter enemy and moreover try to destroy it." He then interpreted the Zionist project of the 1930s as the latest chapter in this very, very long history of Jewish enmity towards Islam. And that the Zionist project was a very consequential part of that longer history. Now, he would have remained an interesting figure of some local significance if Nazism in the Second World War had not intervened, but he was able to escape from British troops and police, and he arrived in Nazi Berlin in November 1941. And I realize that for many of the people in the room, what I'm about to say is familiar, so please bear with me. He arrived in Berlin and spoke with Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, and then, even more famously, spoke with Adolf Hitler on November 28th, 1941. And as a result, Husseini and others who came with him to Berlin served as collaborated with the Nazi regime in producing Arabic language broadcasts to the Middle East. So what is Herf doing talking about this? Doesn't read Arabic, mind your own business, etc. The United States had an ambassador in Cairo named Alexander Kirk. And Alexander Kirk had been had worked in the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, and he worked in the U.S. Embassy in Berlin until it was closed in 1941. And he was very aware of the nature of the Nazi regime. Soon after he arrived in Cairo as the U.S. ambassador, he set up a team of translators, native Arabic speakers and American diplomats, who then translated and transcribed the Arabic language broadcasts coming from Berlin and sent the transcripts back to Washington, and it was called Access Broadcast in Arabic. And Access Broadcast in Arabic was classified until 1977, and then just gathered dust for many decades, and then I found it in 2007. And it is a remarkable set of documents about Nazi Germany's attempt to appeal to Muslims and Arabs. But Husseini spoke on the radio often, and I'll just give you a few examples of what it sounded like. He brought the themes of Islam and the Jews to bear on the on the events of the Second World War. He said, the Quran said the Jews heat the cauldron of war and bring corruption on earth, and God does not like those who corrupt. Such are their ways. The first enemies of the Muslims are today the Jews and the British and the Americans who support them. So he inserted this conspiracy theory that, and this interpretation of Islam that he had developed in 1937 into the events of the Second World War, and associated the Jews with the Soviet Union, with Britain and the United States, and that Nazi Germany was fighting against the enemies of Islam and the Arabs. The broadcasts, even when Husseini was not on the radio, were very radical. On November 3rd of 1943, the Voice of Free Arabism in Berlin broadcast a program entitled Palestine Between the Bolsheviks and the Jews, and it said the Jews kindled this war in the interest of Zionism, and the world will never be at peace till the Jewish race is exterminated. So Zionism in 1943 was not a state. It was just an idea. There was a movement, but that the Zionists would have kindled the Second World War was a remarkable statement. And the broadcasts were virulent. Those of you who've read my Jewish Enemy, the book The Jewish Enemy on Nazi Propaganda in Germany, know that the regime in its broadcast was very frank and informed the German public that it was murdering the Jews, exterminating, annihilating, that this was happening. But the broadcasts to the Middle East were even more blunt, urging listener participation. And this is Husseini in March of 44. Arabs, rise up and fight for your rights, kill the Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God, history, and religion. Now, Emanuel Seller, the Democratic congressman from Brooklyn, was listening. And Haj Amin al-Husseini, in the course of the Second World War, was a famous man. He was not obscure. If you were, when you look at the demonstrations that I looked at and the reports about them in Israel's Moment, people referred to the Mufti. And just the phrase, the Mufti, was a familiar term, and people knew that it referred to Husseini. And Emanuel Seller is a great political figure. There's a need for a biography of Seller, I think. Seller urged Telford Taylor and Robert Jackson, the American prosecutors in Nuremberg, to bring Husseini to trial in Nuremberg. And the American Zionist Emergency Council did so, and Robert Wagner and Frieda Kirchwehr at The Nation and I.F. Stone at PM. And it was a kind of a leftist cause célèbre. Let's bring Husseini to Nuremberg and find out, reveal to the world what the State Department knows in its files about what he did during the Second World War. And the reason that the American Zionist Emergency Council, Stephen Wise and Abba Silber, two rabbis, said, we need to bring this guy to trial so that he does not revive his political career in the Middle East. Because the conflict that, and this was the Zionists says, our conflict with the Arabs in Palestine is about borders and territory. It's not about God said we should be here and you should be there. It's about borders and territory. There were people who thought it was about something else, but the Zionist leadership was willing to talk about borders and territory. But if Husseini returned to political prominence, Seller and others and Wise and Silber were worried it would become a war of religion, which would be impossible to compromise. Husseini had been arrested by the French government in April of 1945, and he was held under house arrest near Paris for the next year. And I examined the French files of his, and he had very interesting conversations with French diplomats in the summer and fall of 1945, in which he convinced the French diplomats that it would be to their advantage to be on his good side and not deliver him to the British, who wanted to deport him to some obscure island, or certainly not to Nuremberg, where he would be put on trial. And so the French concluded that, yes, in order to restore French influence in Lebanon and North Africa, it would be good to get on Husseini's good side, and the conditions of his house arrest were so lenient that in June of 46, he was able to disguise himself in female clothing and get on a Pan Am flight or a TWA flight, one of them, from Paris to Cairo. And the Husseini case, which I'm dwelling on here a bit, is one that I think should be considered as related to an issue that we historians of Europe at the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War have examined. Those of you who've read Tony Judd's Post-War fine book will understand what I'm talking about. When he talked about Europe being built on the basis of amnesia, of short-term amnesia, and this quick shift from anti-fascism, relatively quick shift, to anti-communism, from the mentalities of the Second World War to those of the Cold War, that meant, it's a familiar story to those of you who know history of post-war Germany, that many people who had blood on their hands and should have been brought to trial were either not brought to trial, or those who had been convicted and indicted and convicted received early release. And that forgetting, which is so familiar to historians of German history, that forgetting is also related to the history of the Husseini case. He was one of those collaborators who benefited from that very rapid shift of the mentalities of the Second World War to those of the Cold War. And so there was not the kind of reckoning that should have taken place. Not that Husseini should have been killed or should have been tortured, no, but that a trial in those years would have punctured his attempt at a political comeback. I was going to say something about Merrick Garland and Donald Trump, but yeah, I'd better restrain myself. So he returned to Cairo in 1946, and he received a hero's welcome. And one of the people who was most enthusiastic about him was Hassan al-Banna, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Americans, well, he made a public statement. It wasn't some great secret, but in the American files, the diplomats there recorded him as saying that he was a hero who had challenged an empire and fought Zionism with the help of Hitler and Germany. Germany and Hitler are gone, but Amin al-Husseini will continue the struggle. Lord Almighty did not preserve Amin for nothing. So my colleague, Matthias Kunzel, has published a book in 2019, which is now in English, called Nazis, Islamic Anti-Semitism in the Middle East. And Matthias, his hypothesis is that the war of 1948 has many causes, but one of the causes is an aftershock of World War II, and that the war of religion that Husseini announced in 1937 continued in the decision of the Arab Higher Committee that Husseini was the leader of, to wage war and rather than accept the UN partition resolution. Now, in the 1950s and 1960s, Islamist organizations faded into the background in world politics. And I think the reason they faded into the background was that the Muslim Brothers, was that the events that I've just described to you were actually famous, that they were not obscure, and that the connection between Husseini and the Nazis was not something that only the CIA knew about, or it was part of the global liberal political discourse. And so that taint, the Nazi taint, meant that the Islamist tradition was not going to dominate Arab politics in the era of secular nationalism of Nasser and others. So that takes us to the significance of the Soviet Union. Because what the Soviet Union did that the Muslim Brotherhood could not do was to take the prestige of anti-fascism and the prestige around the world associated with the Red Army and its victory over the Wehrmacht, and to place the prestige of anti-fascism in the service of the antagonism to Israel. And it was the Soviet Union, in this, especially after the war of 1967, that articulated the fundamentals of the language that came to be so important in the last 25 years in Western intellectual life, associating the Israelis as Nazis, talking about their wars of defense as acts of aggression and genocide, to describe Zionism as a form of of colonialism. Settler colonialism came later, and to make the word Zionism a term of abuse for the global left. That was the accomplishment of the Soviet Union. That was not something that the Muslim Brotherhood could have done. So let's then turn to the Hamas Charter. I think I'll speak for like about 5 or 10 minutes more, and then we'll have a discussion. The failure of the secular nationalists to defeat Israel in 1967 and 1973 led to more and more criticism and to the resurgence of the Islamist organizations, and especially in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution and the establishment of the Islamic Republic. So a decade later, Hamas issued its famous charter, and I don't. It's when one never knows for sure. What I can assume, if the charter is familiar to you or not, I assume that for some of you it's quite familiar, but I'm going to err on the side of caution here and remind you that the opening paragraph quotes the martyr Hassan al-Banna, who stated that Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. Now, it dispenses with the idea that obliterating Israel is not a form of antagonism to Jews. It states our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious, and it goes back to the time of the birth of the Islamic message of the righteous ancestor, for Allah is its target, the Prophet is its example, and the Quran is its constitution. And so what the charter did and what Hamas did was the same thing that Husseini was doing in 1937, presenting itself as an interpretation of the religion of Islam. Now, as European historians, we know that, and in this room there are some important historians of Christianity, we know where Judaism, we know that religions can be interpreted in different ways. This is not some profound insight, but it should be applied to the history of Islamism as well. What the Hamas Charter did was, what Husseini did in 1937, was to present the religion of Islam as itself an inherently anti-Jewish theology, and a prophetic and messianic one. It presented the obliteration of the state of Israel as a religious obligation, and it says the prophet, Allah bless him, said the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. So the destruction of the state of Israel in the Charter is presented as a necessary for a day of redemption and deliverance. So this is no longer about borders and territory. This is a religious obligation of a far more profound dimension. Most of the Charter is about this interpretation of the Quran and its application to the realities, or as it sees them, the realities of Israel and in the 1970s and 80s. But there's one charter, and in that sense, it is the like Husseini's 1937 text. It is not an impact. It is not the result of Western colonialism, imperialism, Orientalism, or what the West has done to them. It is the result of an autonomous, indigenous, creative interpretation of their own. But there's one aspect of the Charter in which that's not the case, and that's Article 22. Article 22 can be understood as a result of Western cultural imperialism or Western cultural influence. As it is long, I'll just read a couple sentences about it, and you'll see the Western influence in Article 22. They, the Jews, were behind World War I when they were able to destroy the Islamic Caliphate, making financial gains and controlling resources. They obtained the Balfour Declaration. They were behind the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution. Most of the revolutions we hear about, they were able to control imperialistic countries and colonize many others. They were behind World War II, through which they made huge financial gains, trading in armaments, and paved the way for the establishment of the state. They instigated the replacement of the League of Nations with the United Nations and the Security Council to enable them to rule the world through them. There is no war going on anywhere without having their finger in it. And Article 22 is a restatement of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion with the events of the Second World War as a background. So there you have it. The Charter of 1988 was now visible in the State Department, in the British Foreign Office, in the Auswärtiges Amt, in the Quai d'Orsay. It was clear that this organization had uttered a document that was profoundly, by anybody's definition, anti-Semitic. That is, it was a document of hatred against Judaism, the Jews, and therefore the state of Israel. So this is not an ambiguous document. This is not a document about which we can have interesting discussions here about, is it anti-Zionism or is it anti-Semitism? This is not Yasser Arafat. This is not the PLO declaration. We have had lots of arguments about the ambiguities of the PLO and all that. There's nothing ambiguous about the 1988 document. It didn't make a big splash. On January 5th of 1993, the Washington Post published 5 paragraphs of its 36 articles. The first mention of the Charter in the New York Times appeared on April 16th of 2009 in an extremely good 220-word letter to the editor, bless brevity, by the late Israeli political theorist Shlomo Aveniri. In the years since, the New York Times has not published extensive sections of the Charter, nor has it offered its readers an article that fully presented its core arguments and language. So in 2003, Matthias Kunzel published Jihad und Judenhass by a small left-wing press in Freiburg, Germany. And that was the first public examination of the Hamas Charter and its significance by any scholar in Israel, Europe, or the United States, other than Aveniri. And then in 2007, Russell Berman took the initiative, and Telos published the English translation, and I wrote the foreword. In 2010, our excellent colleague Meyer Litvak, a historian at the Dayan Center in the Development of Middle Eastern and African History at Tel Aviv, University of Tel Aviv, published Martyrdom is Life, Jihad and Martyrdom in the Ideology of Hamas, but that was in a specialist journal, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. And Litvak called the document, the Charter, the most important document of contemporary Islamism, but it aroused very little interest beyond scholarly specialists. And then something else happened. And I don't know, I have not examined the history of this word, but there's a Begriffsgeschichte here to be undertaken about who invented the term Islamophobia. And the term Islamophobia, we know enough, did not emerge out of the scholarly world. It emerged out of the political world from Islamist organizations. And the purpose of the term Islamophobia was to associate criticism of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Iranian government with attacks on the religion of Islam. So its purpose was to deflect criticism of the Islamist organizations by making the case that to criticize them was to criticize Islam. And that was a form of, obviously, religious intolerance. And then if by implication that was a criticism of Muslims, then it was not only religious intolerance, it was a form of racism. So nobody wants to be a racist or a religious bigot. The term Islamophobia has been very effective, I think, in blunting criticism of this phenomenon. So in 2017, Hamas issued a more secular form of its statement, and some people thought that meant that it was turning away from the religious radicalism of 1988, but in fact that was not the case. It restated its determination to eliminate the state of Israel completely, and to insist on a right of return from the river to the sea, which would eliminate the state, and to do so by force of arms. On October 10th of 2007, October 10th of 2023, Quillette published my essay, The Ideology of Mass Murder, which I wrote over the weekend. And I was not surprised. I mean, I guess I was as surprised that this happened, but it flowed. The attack of October 7th flowed from the ideas that I had been examining and other people had been examining for quite a while. October 7th, to me, was an example of the unity of ideology and policy, and that it was yet again a demonstration of the importance of intellectual and cultural history and the causal import of ideas and the impact of ideas and ideology on major politics in the world. And the people who underestimated Hamas were not limited to the United States or Germany or Europe, but the Israeli, as you know, the Israeli government as well, which also seemed to have suffered under a materialist illusion. And the materialist illusion was that if, with help from funding from Qatar, that Israel that the Gazans would be happy being able to have Mercedes-Benz and nice houses overlooking the Mediterranean and shopping malls that looked like shopping malls in Europe, which existed. If they could have those things, then they would serve as the materialist solvent that would dissolve the ideological fanaticism of the Charter of 1988. And what was the alternative, after all, to the materialist illusion? Well, the alternative was to go to war. So it's easy in retrospect to say how stupid Netanyahu was and what a bunch of idiots they all were to think that the materialist policy of pumping money into Gaza would reduce the flames of radicalism. But hope is a powerful thing. So Perhaps on this campus, you had an experience similar to my own at Maryland. Several weeks after the attack, 75 members of the School of Humanities, including a number of my colleagues in the history department, signed a letter saying historical context matters. And the historical context that mattered was not the one that I've spoken to you about this evening. It was about the historical context as articulated by Rashid Khalidi and of 75 years of Israeli oppression, expulsion, dispossession, and injustice. And that, of course, they included a few sentences expressing horror at what happened on October 7th, but in the end, it served as a kind of apologia to the interrupted genocide of that day and days. The thesis that I'm presenting this evening is that we need to think more about the 90 years of a Islamist religious war that against the Jews and then the state of Israel. Because I think that if it hadn't been for the Islamists, this war would long ago have been over. And there would have been a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank long ago. I think it's time to conclude. The liberal tradition in this country is weak. The center is weak. Those of you who know my essays about politics know that in 2016 I warned about Trump and the appeals of fascism. The arguments I'm making today are not part of a broader authoritarian trend in Washington. The more that this struggle, interpretation, whatever phrase you want to use, about anti-Semitism becomes associated with the Trump administration, the more difficult it will be to make the case here at Berkeley and on our campuses that all decent people should fight against anti-Semitism, because it'll then be associated with Elon Musk, who's trying to take my neighbor's job away. Rather, we need to recognize that Jew hatred and elements of fascism are terrible things, whether they come from the far right or from the leaders of Hamas. In a way, I think I'm preaching to the choir this evening, but sometimes stating the obvious is important. So thanks for your patience.
So I think we have about half an hour or so of space for conversation and questions. And of course, we'll also have some time after that for people who want to have some one-on-one opportunities to talk with Professor Herf. So we'll just start off with open questions and conversation now.
Mark?
Thanks, Jeff. Great talk. I was curious about, you explained why the German left seems to be exceptional with respect to not being.
You can find all the conventional leftist attitudes in Germany about Israel that you find in the United States as well. I don't want to present it as a.
Okay, so maybe it's not exceptional. So the question I have is, just to hear you reflect on why it is that the left seems to gravitate, infamously, UC Berkeley's Judith Butler talks about Hamas as part of the global left, and what is it about, Islamicist, fundamentalist, fascist, you can just, what is your sense about how it is that
I pose this as a question to the fellow historians here in the room. I can't think of another example since the French Revolution, certainly since the Bolshevik Revolution, in which the global left has expressed enthusiasm, some mixture of enthusiasm, of apologia, support, absence of criticism for an organization like Hamas or the government of Iran. We all know that there were people our age, when we were kids, who had nice things to say about Ho Chi Minh. Even there were a few Mao Zedong, goodness, and Castro, and whatever else you want to say about these dictators, they had some affiliation or connection to the legacy of the French Revolution. But what is so peculiar to me about what has happened in recent decades is that the people who define themselves as progressives and leftists refused to speak frankly about organizations that in every way are part of the tradition of the counter-revolution since the French Revolution. Whether it's about cultural issues, about homosexuality, about equality between men and women, about the Jews, about democracy, just name almost any dimension. Why? And I think the reason is that that millions of people have convinced themselves that Israel actually is what the Soviet Union said it was. That it is a genocidal, aggressive, racist, colonial state that has no legitimacy in existing. And if you take that view, that Israel is as evil as take it, the Soviet Union, the PLO, whatever, as UN resolutions, if it is that evil, then why not support whoever is going to help to destroy it? After all, Roosevelt and Churchill made a pact with the devil with Stalin. Now, there were people who said, well, doesn't this corrupt the anti-Hitler coalition to make an alliance with Stalin? Well, but he was fighting Hitler, so we're making a pact with the devil. But Roosevelt and Churchill didn't really sing the praises of the Soviet dictatorship. It was gnashing teeth and, yes, they are suffering and we are in the same fight. But I do think that that's a very distinctive aspect of what has happened the last 25 years. The Hitler-Stalin pact occurs to me as a moment when the communist parties said, well, Hitler, Britain and France were trying to turn Hitler against the Soviets in Munich, which is not what they were trying to do, but but from Stalin's perspective, that's what they were trying to do. And Stalin said, well, two can play this game, and now I'm going to turn Hitler against you. And furthermore, we're not ready for the a German invasion in 1939. But the communists, even during the pact, those who did not leave the communist parties, those who stayed in, the hardcore, and here I would defer to some of the historians of American communism, so I'm probably saying more than I know here, but I don't think that there were American communists who were singing the praises of Hitler, talking about how marvelous it is that the Soviet Union was in an alliance with Hitler. So I think I think what has happened in the last 25 years is exceptional. One more thing. On campus, people use the phrase the Palestinians. It's ubiquitous, the Palestinians. But they don't want to talk, or talk less rarely, about Hamas. Now, there is a video of a demonstration outside of Columbia University last spring in which there is a group of unidentified people who look like they're in their 20s and 30s who have clearly practiced a chant. And the chant is, Hamas, Hamas, we love your rockets too. And then I don't remember the exact phrasing of the next, but it's something about bombing Tel Aviv and please do, So there's that. There are some, really hardcore, but the phrase the Palestinians obscures the term Hamas. And it's as a question for historians in the future to try and figure out how this happened, that the people who regard themselves as leftists and progressives would look at the Hamas Charter and and what Hamas did on October 7th and still engaged in all these demos. I'm going to give shorter answers from now, but yeah.
Well, looking at 68, as you know I have, I don't think we want to take the extreme voices for the whole left-wing reaction to Israel. And so that brings me to my question, Jeffrey. I think it's really important what you did is to talk about the ideology in a non-reductive way, to grant it some autonomy. But I'd be curious to hear your view of the other side. So is the right-wing settler ideology in Israel, is it autogenetic in the same way as the Islamic ideology is? And would you place that in the context of the kind of Islamophobia that you're talking about on the left?
One of the reasons that I wrote Israel's Moment was to draw the attention of a current English language readership to the secular nature of the founding Zionist generation. And these were people who had, the lesson they drew from the Holocaust was that we had to take matters into our own hands, and we're not going to pray that God is going to come save us from anybody, and that we're modern people, and that yes, there's a connection of the Jews to the land of Palestine, but we're not going to go to war again on the basis of what's in the Bible about where Abraham was said to have been born. And that Zionist generation is furious now at the settlers. Their children who are in the IDF, they are furious at the settlers. And they view the settlers as an attack on Zionism.
Right.
Yeah. So your question, I think the annexation and behavior of the settlers on the West Bank is horrible, but I don't think it's why Hamas attacked on October 7th. I think this, I cut to the chase. I think, as I repeat what I said, I think the single most important reason why this conflict has not been resolved long ago is Islamic religious fanaticism. There was that moment when Arafat was like, should I, shouldn't I? Barak gave him the deal, and Ehud Olmert gave him the deal, but there was always that threat that he would be assassinated. And the PLO leadership would be assassinated by the Islamists. So I think that the Islamists were very important in bringing a right-wing government into presence in Israel, and making the Israeli left sort of just irrelevant for a lot of the electorate. I hold them responsible. I don't think that's a good answer to your question, but
Well, I don't want to take up everybody's time. I'm just wondering if it's autogenetic in the same way. I agree with you. It's not a reaction to the settlers, but are these two ideologies, in what way, right, are they non-reductive in the way that you beautifully described there?
well, clearly, if you believe in an Israel from from the sea to the river,
Yeah.
there's going to be constant war. It'll just be a permanent war, and then you have ignoramus like Trump, who is just knows nothing, and it's embarrassing what he says about the Riviera and the Mediterranean, and so. You remember the bus bombings in 1990s when there was this chance that Shimon Peres might win the election, and then they blew up buses in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. They knew exactly what they were doing, and one of the things that we European historians know is when you think about Gavrilo Princip or about the assassination of, excuse me, I'm having a senior moment, of the German foreign minister in the 1920s. Political assassinations make a big difference. They do influence. Terrorism has an impact. So it's I think that's more than that I would say. Yeah, Marty.
There are 100 ways we could, engage in this. We will perhaps over dinner. You mentioned political assassination, the assassination of Rabin.
Yes, right, of course.
By radical right-wing Zionists.
Yes.
Is a moment in a different narrative, a narrative that, say, Rashid Khalidi would give us, in which there are many examples of Jewish agency, Zionist agency, Israeli agency. I mean, you've given us, I think, a powerful narrative of how this particular ideology created in the Arab world, Palestinian world, a kind of intransigence that then had an impact, perhaps leading to October 7th. Context included perhaps other things as well. There is also Jewish agency. And whether or not the pioneers were as benign as you painted them, from the get-go, there was a kind of, let's say, deep indifference to the population that was there and its interests. There were some exceptions, but by and large, I think that's fairly well established. And one can do a counter-narrative in which Jewish agency plays a significant role. And I don't want to give that here, I mean, let other people do that.
I'm aware of it, yes.
So one can't do it simply agent passive. There has to be this dialectic of different agencies, each side making moronic mistakes, each side having moments when it could have gone this way or went that way. I want to ask you a question about another face of anti-Semitism, which exists, and you've already alluded to it, which is philo-Semitism. One can argue, Goldhagen said philo-Semitism is a wolf in sheep's clothing. You mentioned Trump. There is, and in Germany as well, a very strong pro-Zionist, pro-Israeli philo-Semitism, in which figures like Stefanik or Huckabee have an attitude towards the Jews coming from perhaps a restorationist version of Christianity, which involves a kind of total idealization of the Jews in ways that, can be perhaps as obviously stereotypical and unrealistic as anti-Semitism. Now, philo-Semitism fits in also to the very troubling fact that the right wing around the world is philo-Semitic and very pro-Israel. Trump has enormous popularity in Israel today. A very, very troubling number. Numbers are 70% would have voted for. In other words, there is a way in which the Israelis have become themselves their worst enemies. And Orban and other people around the world who are part of an international right see in Israel and in Netanyahu an example of what they want. Now, you call yourself, Trump, a fascist. If Judith Butler is to be attacked for misrepresenting Hamas as part of the global left, don't you worry about the fact that the Israelis love this fascist as much as they do?
I don't know if I think that there's a majority in Israel that wants the Netanyahu government gone.
Majority?
Yes. I think if there were elections, he would lose. I think if there were elections, he would lose the election. I think that there's still a majority of Israel. Look, what distinguishes the Israelis is they're the only professional middle class in the entire world whose children are drafted into the military and all go into the military. They are the majority of Israeli citizens are very much like the middle classes in Europe and the United States, and they don't approve of the Haredi. They're furious at these people who are blackmailing the government and avoiding military service. And the I don't. There is this Israel that is modern, that is, but what can I say? It is surrounded, or was surrounded, by all of these antagonists. The philo-Semitism, I don't think that there's a majority in Israel, in Germany, that supports the settlers, or supports annexation, or kicking the Gazans out of Gaza. I don't think that level of support, that extent of support for Israel goes that far. I don't think it's uncritical. The term philo-Semitism implies that people have a romanticized and uncritical attitude towards Israel, and that basically whatever Israel does is fine. And I don't think that's a widespread view in the German government, in German politics, German intellectual life, or I don't see it. What you said about Huckabee and Stefanik is certainly correct, and that's the problem of polarization that I was addressing at the outset.
Aren't you though upset by the fact that Gentile Germans criticize people like Nancy Fraser and Judith Butler, who were Jewish, for being anti-Semitic? Isn't there something odd about that moment that somehow the official, and it is very official, they were prevented from coming to Germany or getting the awards or whatever they were supposed to get. They were made to be pariahs by a government that had a Staatsräson, which was defense of Israel no matter what. So I think the German case, Dirk Moses is a good friend of ours, a former student of mine, has of course been much involved. He recently was prevented from having a conference that he had organized in Frankfurt from being held at the University of Frankfurt. He had to go off campus because politicians complained that it was anti-Israel. There's something very bizarre about the philo-Semitic nature of the German government at the moment, which has to be confronted. It's really, one can understand why, there are historical reasons why, but it is not, I would say, it's not very good for the Jews.
I think
a lot in two different sentiments, because I don't see Huckabee and that crowd as philo-Semitic.
No, I think ultimately they're not.
They're not
But the German government also.
The German government may be.
Well, in
so
some
there
ways.
may be sentiments there, or where's good, where's good to be in philo-Semitism.
all right, I'm gonna take the speaker's privilege and because there actually are now a number of different questions.
We've got a couple of questions over on that side.
So Professor Jay, you have to just be quiet for a minute. So, yes.
Actually, I'm going to refrain from commenting on this conversation. I spent a lot of time in Germany, and my work is on fascism and culturalism.
And you are?
Oh, I'm Karen Fiss, and I'm not associated with Berkeley. So I'm curious, actually, going back to the Soviet piece. I've read and heard the Russian scholar who's given a talk at the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. Basically, the Soviet model, basically how a lot of the Soviet
Isabella Tabarovsky?
Yes,
Yeah.
how a lot of the propaganda that was generated in the Soviet Union is even a lot of the imagery. And obviously there's a long-standing history of anti-Semitism in Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union. But can you explain how that ended up either, and not everything is explained through rational goals, but I know Abbas did his PhD in Soviet Union. How did the Soviet Union become that?
Through the United Nations. The United Nations is enormously important in modern intellectual and cultural history. And historians of the history of the 20th and 21st century should pay close attention to United Nations institutions, because that is, I think the United Nations exerts a profound impact on the intellectual and cultural world, literally. it is not always in the headlines in the American press, but what appears in its Human Rights Council statements or General Assembly resolutions, what starts at the United Nations sometimes winds up on syllabi in American universities.
Yeah.
So I think that is, and the Soviet diplomats were very good, very, very good at the United Nations. They devoted a lot of attention and a lot of expertise. They were very good on committees, very good on wording. For example, wording, what do we mean by terrorism? And there were very interesting discussions and important discussions in the United Nations about the meaning of terrorism. Well, what is it? What happens if it's part of a struggle of national liberation against colonialism? You know? So if you then redefine the PLO's activities in that context, and so these language games are enormously significant, and I think that's how that is. Very important. Really, I think intellectual and cultural historians need to pay a lot more attention to the linguistic politics of the United Nations.
And do you happen to know anyone working on that? I mean, I know.
Well, I've written, I in my own work regarding Germany, in the undeclared wars, and I became more aware of that, and the extent to which both the Soviet Union and Germany, but many other countries, devoted a lot of time and effort. So I don't know, but if there are people here who are, working on there are people working on your international relations, and I think that's the language of international relations is profoundly influenced by United Nations politics.
I see a student question as well.
Yeah. So this is a question actually because of your book on undeclared war, and I guess the Soviet story is somewhat known, and I see today, to answer why is it that progressives today ally themselves with Hamas and all these movements that seem so unprogressive. When I read like Fathom Journal or K Magazine, the same answer comes again and again and again, is that the left was fashioned through Soviet propaganda and language to being primarily anti-colonial rather than anti-fascist. But the German case to me is unknown. And I'm wondering, why is it that, the German far left, who clearly probably emerged out of their anti-fascist leanings, was so quick they were essentially pioneers of an anti-Zionist left. And I'm curious if you could...
Well, it gets into certain psychobabble about, you're talking about Ulrich Meinhof or some of the other leftists of the 1969, 70, 71, 72, and the argument was that the tradition of coming to terms with the Nazi past was burdening guilt on subsequent generations and was standing in the way of understanding the need for revolution in Germany. So in order to unlock true consciousness and develop a revolutionary consciousness in Germany, it was necessary to abandon this tradition and to understand that solidarity with the Palestinians against the Jews was necessary to make revolution in Germany. Because after all, why are the Palestinians oppressed? The Palestinians are oppressed because of the Nazis, and the Nazis carried out the Holocaust, and then that gave the Jews the rationale for oppressing the Palestinians. So in order to unburden ourselves from this horrible legacy of guilt, we will now identify ourselves with the real victims of National Socialism, not the Jews, but the Palestinians. And this is articulated, the gentleman, I forget the gentleman's name, in a famous leaflet called Shalom and Napalm in 1969.
Kunzelmann.
Yes, Kunzelmann. And then Ulrich Meinhof in 1972 celebrated the attack on the Israeli athletes in Munich as a revolutionary deed, an anti-fascist deed. But I want to return to the point I made at the outset. that people like Otto Schilly and Joschka Fischer, Volker Beck, they knew Ulrike Meinhof. They knew Dieter Kunzelmann. They were all young at the same time. They were part of that scene. And they saw it up close, or somewhat up close. And and that's one reason why after 9/11, it wasn't philo-Semitism. It was in their view a continuation of a fight against fascism. So no, they're not fans of the settlers. They're not fans of the right wing in Israel, but they were. They did reject the arguments that were being made in the late 60s and early 70s about Martin Jay was a very unusual guy in 1969 and 1970, because if you were around my age, the last thing that you were doing when Marty was writing The Dialectical Imagination was writing serious books. And so he is a bit of an intellectual hero to many of us, because when a lot of us at that age had concluded that intellectual life was for sissies, Marty was writing this important book and teaching a lot of us that the world of scholarship and learning was really important. So Otto Schilly and Joschka Fischer and Volker Beck and others were learning a similar kind of a lesson. And so was I. I don't think it made us uncritical in our views of the state of Israel, but we did have a sense that there really were people who were trying to kill the Jews, that this was happening again. And I think Dana Horn has made this point in People Love Dead Jews, that we did not want the phrase "never again" to become a stupid cliche. Never again is Hitler going to kill the Jews of Europe. It doesn't mean that. So it meant that when the Ayatollahs said they were going to wipe Israel off the map, we were not going to be the smarty pants who said they don't really mean it, or it's bureaucratic politics in Tehran. We like anybody, we could be mistaken in our interpretations or assessments, but we didn't want to make that mistake yet again. Enough said about that. This gentleman had a question at the outset. Yes.
I'd be interested if there's any work on how the public consciousness worldwide is manipulated in the sense of Hitler's big lie, and in the sense of the psychological effect on Jewish people who become capos. A lot of this happens without our agreement or understanding or awareness, but I think it has a huge effect historically.
I think something needs to be said, that there are 8 billion people in the world, and there are about 17 million of us are Jews. It doesn't really help to start referring to other people as capos. What we need is solidarity with one another. Doesn't mean we don't criticize each other, but we are very few, very, very few. And the people who despise us know that we are very few. I think that it's this is getting me a bit off the track of the arguments, but
I was thinking of capos as a mental illness rather than pointing a finger at
I
someone.
don't want to talk about mental illness.
Uh-huh.
I don't want to talk. I don't think that's helpful. We disagree. let's have an argument, let's talk about the evidence, but I don't want to talk about mental illness or try and play Dr. Freud, with other people's opinions. That's not helpful because the situation now is very serious. I think, and if it's serious, yeah. Enough said. Yeah, Ethan.
Thank you for the talk, Jeff. I was wondering to go back to really the sort of the heart of the talk. I was a little bit surprised, and it's probably developed much more in the book, which I'm looking forward to reading, to not hear you talk much about anti-Westernism in terms of the way that this Islamism developed. And I think from my own work, my sense is that that's actually crucial also to the answer to the question that you're asking about why Hamas has become such a accepted cause among a certain left. And so I just was wondering, it seems to me that the story you tell about Islamism, there's a moment where anti-Westernism becomes very important and very aligned with anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism for these folks. And I'm just wondering if you see that fitting into.
Well, that's 9/11. That's Muhammad Atta. That's the planes in the World Trade Center. That captured the anti-Westernism and the anti-Semitism, perfectly.
It captured it. Sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, a lot of the ideas are already there, saying like Sayyid Qutb, generated earlier, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, and I think, that this, and Eli was getting at it partly in talking about the way that people talk about sort of anti-colonialism. Another way to think about it is sort of saturation of third worldism on large parts of the left. But this paradigm of Western colonial evil oppression, when that's the overriding paradigm, it somehow seems to override many of the conventional political divides that would have separated a group like Hamas generations ago from the left.
Here I think we need to pay more attention to economic historians. Because when you listen to people talking about colonialism in recent years, you would get the impression that much of the world is still under the British and French Empire. One of the enduring aspects of this is condescension towards most of the rest of the world. It's been a long time since Britain and France carved up Africa. It's a long time in Asia and Latin America. And if countries have made a mess of things, or if they have done good things, it's up to them. When I was, Oscar was a student at social studies in the 1980s, when I was spoiled rotten with students like him and Tony Blinken, and my boss was David Landis. And what I learned from Landis as an economic historian was that there was no such thing as the third world. That Latin America had Brazil, and where they speak Portuguese, and Argentina, where they speak Spanish, and that there were these many different countries, and they didn't particularly like to be referred to as Latinos, and the people from Korea and the Philippines didn't particularly like to be referred to as Asians, that they were different. And that some of them did very well economically, and some of them made a mess. And but if you then say all of our problems are because of colonialism and slavery, or what happened years ago, and at a certain point you have to assume responsibility for what's going on. And I think that the scholars who have done most to articulate that are the economic historians. I think the Nobel Prize, it must be, the last Nobel Prize in economics went to a couple of economists who were drawing attention to local circumstances about economic development and democracy. A figure like Donald Trump is a cartoon character of American imperialism. It's a caricature. The anti-Westernism, you're right. Of course, you're very right. But that also gets at the cultural dimension of the Hamas Charter, because it is a rejection of modernity and of the West. That gets back to the point that I was making throughout the talk about the paradox of support for such a anti-modernist organization.
So it's now 6:35, so we've gone a little bit past time. So what I'm going to now do is actually invite anyone who has additional questions to come up and talk with Professor Herf directly. Apologies for cutting off the conversation, but want to make sure that those who need to leave are able to do so, including the person who's videotaping us, and that we're able to get out of the room in time. So
it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Please do.